Welcome to a Prevent Connect podcast, where we explore the prevention of violence against women. This is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault.
Hello, this is David Lee from Prevent Connect, and I am really pleased to be able to have this conversation with three colleagues, or maybe I should say comrades of mine. As many of you know, I am one of the movement makers from the Move to End Violence initiative that's funded by the Novo Foundation, and I'm part of Cohort 3, and I'm here with the other male cohort members of Cohort 3, and we're going to be talking about our experiences from our International Learning Exchange, where we just returned from South Africa and learned so much in a very powerful experience. So I am joined here by Andrew Santana from Day One. How are you doing, Andrew?
Hey, I'm really well. I'm really glad to be able to join y'all.
Great, and I'm also joined by Quentin Walcott from Connect in New York City.
Hey, brothers, how are you? Glad to be part of this.
Great, and just so people know, we as everyone else calls Quentin Q. One of the things that impressed me in South Africa is how different issues were linked in ways that were much more profound there than we see in this country. And you know, the HIV and the work to end sexual violence and domestic violence are much more tight in South Africa and throughout Africa, and actually throughout the world. And that was those discussions. And Andrew, you really, I remember vividly you talking about, after seeing urban farming, of how you saw how urban farming could be part of the work to be able to end sexual violence and domestic violence in our communities. And that I saw the food sovereignty work, and I saw the work for immigrant rights, and I saw that all of that became we could deal with the issues of ending violence against women and girls in an integral way. But I also saw a little bit of most of these organizations didn't necessarily have the primary focus on engaging men. I know, Q, you and I, outside of our official delegation, got a chance to meet with some colleagues from Zonke Gender Justice. I met with them in Cape Town, and you met with them in Johannesburg. And so, Q, I just want to get your thoughts about, as a man, and the role that men can play, the role that men can play as members of a movement, and for us as movement makers here in the United States, those lessons and how that applies to our movement here in this country.
To be honest with you guys, I'm still processing this trip in ways that you wouldn't believe. Just one as being a black male, part of the African diaspora, being, living in the United States and in New York City in particular, being such an international city. So many things still come to mind. But, one thing for me was that, yes, and I agree, probably because of the structure of this program, Move to End Violence, and, centering around women and girls, and also IDEX and their experiences and their partnerships throughout Africa. The organization that we met with, although many of them had men as part of the co-leadership and as part of the membership of many of the organizations that we met with. So for me, it was really, it was a missing piece, in terms of, how can men truly be, allies or comrades in this work? And what does that really look like, and how does that play out? There's definitely, I saw a respect for women leadership in ways that maybe aren't the same here in New York City or the United States, and always kind of thought about, Black Lives Matter and, that work that's being done here in the United States. And that also is an emerging global movement as well. And just really looking at, male leadership and women's leadership. What does that really look like? What does that mean, in particular, to gender-based violence and work around violence against women and girls? So when I came back, I run a men's roundtable here once a month. I had a specific, theme that was planned well before the trip, and I changed that because I wanted to really kind of reflect on male leadership, and particularly male masculinity, in terms of leaders like Mandela, Sisulu, many of the leadership in South Africa, and then also throughout the African diaspora. Like, how does that leadership and that type of masculinity impact the way we see leadership here in the United States, in particular of movements like Black Lives Matter that are primarily women-led queer-led, youth-led. So what does that really mean for us? And like, I had a roundtable around that. And a lot of the men in the roundtable, we keep a lot of that stuff confidential. But one of the themes came out was that, and I really pushed back because it's really about accountability, was really like, are we even recognizing the leadership that exists? Because I find in the work that women, without a doubt, are unconditional around who they galvanize around in terms of state violence and police violence or any other forms of community violence. But we as men, and particularly men of color, I'll speak to, are a little bit more conditional about what do we galvanize around. So if there's a young man who's a victim of state violence versus a woman who's a victim of state violence, we tend to kind of nitpick or be really conditional about who we're going to galvanize around, when it's without question our sisters in this movement really galvanize around, the men, and particularly men of color, who are victims of, state and structural racism and violence. So all those questions kind of came up for me, and I'm still thinking about what does that really mean. And one thing, many of the organizations that we met with, Leslie Ann Foster, who we met with out there, and she's been in New York since. We've been talking and, figuring out ways that we can kind of work together and continue these conversations, her in particular, about the differences between equity and equality and what does that really mean.
It's cute. It's so fascinating. What your talk brought up for me is it made me think actually about the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right?
Yes.
And how do we bring a movement where we acknowledge the history and not leave anybody behind, right? Or what does it mean to acknowledge the past and create a structure where everybody matters, right? And I think that was something that I think really resonated with me through the trip, because when we did our trip with our experience, our day learning exchange with JDI, thinking about how those folks were organizing prison guards as to train them in bystander intervention with respect to, sexual abuse of male prisoners by other prisoners, or possibly by prison guards. And what does it mean to, think beyond like a rigid structure of who matters and who doesn't matter, because the organizing needs to take place on all levels, and it's like across movements. So, it made me think about, when you were talking, like the political lessons that I learned from South Africa is that, political education is something that needs to happen at all levels, because, victims of gender-based violence may also experience, food insecurity or financial insecurity. Right. And being able to have conversations with those folks about that are things that they get often because it's their lives and they're living them. And what I thought folks in South Africa did really well was really to have those kinds of like cross movement conversations and incorporate them into the work. And whereas in the United States, with the professionalization of the anti-violence movement, has yielded many important gains and victories and structures to address, sort of discrete issues. What I loved about being there was that like the folks, who talked about organizing could talk about things that were going on in the government, and gender-based violence stuff, and food stuff, and racial justice, and all of these other things in a way where it's like, of course that's going on here in the United States, but how can we do that in a better way so that, we can connect in this real way all of the, the connections of systematic oppression, and utilize that to kind of like, build a broader base for the work we're doing in the United States.
I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us, to really explore our impressions from South Africa. It's only the beginning. I resonate with you, Q, and I suspect this is true for both you and Andrew and Ed also. This is taking a lot more time than I thought to process, and I am really reflecting on it, and it's really giving me an opportunity to ask questions about how I operate within our work, and it also gives me great hope to see where we can go, and it also reminds me of how much work we have to do, and still to be able to create the changes that we want to do so we can be able to prevent violence against women and girls from happening in the first place, and to prevent violence against everyone. So I want to thank you for joining us, and invite you to other conversations that this will foster, that each of us will be having throughout the country, and invite you to continue in this discussion with us.
Thank you for listening to this Prevent Connect podcast. Prevent Connect is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, with funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views presented on Prevent Connect are not necessarily the views of the United States government, the CDC, or CalCASA. To learn more about Prevent Connect, visit www.preventconnect.org. For more information about CalCASA's mission, or to show your support, visit calcasa.org. That's CalCasa.org.